So in this video lecture, I'm going to be talking to you guys about metrics. And metrics is a type of poetics, or a component of poetics. Basically, what metrics is, in the simplest sense, is the length of the line and the pattern of unstressed and stressed syllables within a given line of poetry. Now, this is important because patterns of stresses, patterns of syllables, and line lengths help determine the rhythm and the movement and the flow of a poem. So, in English, for instance, most traditional forms of poetry, blank verse, heroic couplets, the sonnet, and so on, use iambic pentameter, because that, for whatever reason, is a line length and a stress pattern that the English language seems to naturally break down into. The French use alexandrines, which are 6-foot lines, as opposed to iambic pentameter, which is a 5-foot line. So this, because for whatever reason, it sounds better in French to have that slightly longer line, 2 syllables longer. So, I've given you guys this chart. I'm definitely posting this to eCampus, and I'm going to try and copy-paste this into the description for the YouTube channel. We'll see how well that goes. But this is a quick guide to metrics, and this has these sort of charts and these sort of explanations of these things that I'm talking about, as well as a scanned version of John Keats's When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be. So, basically, the reason to study metrics, the reason to learn about patterns of syllables, lengths of lines, and all of this stuff, is because it helps us understand the rhythm and it helps us identify poetic forms. So, what's involved in this, basically? This is so when we're dealing with metrics, we're dealing with a process called scanning poetry, and that involves identifying the stressed and unstressed syllables within a given line. And these stressed and unstressed syllables break down into specific patterns called feet. Feet are usually 2 syllables, sometimes they're 3 syllables, occasionally they're 4 syllables. But I've given you guys on this handout, I've given you a list of some of the most common stress patterns. So the most common stress pattern in English is iambic. The iamb, I-A-M-B, which is an unstressed, stressed pattern. And you can see here, I'll try and get this close so you can see it well, the scansion marks for this would be a sort of small U-shaped accent and then a dash over it. And you can see on the other side here where I've marked up Keats's poem, it's marked with those symbols. So, when I have fears that I may cease to be, we have an unstressed, when stressed I. When I have fears that I may cease to be. This is the stressed, unstressed pattern of that line. And he maintains it throughout the poem. Every line, if you look closely at it, has 5 iambic feet. So that's 5 sets of unstressed, stressed syllables. So it would be an iamb. Trochee is stressed, unstressed, so that's a reverse of the iamb. The spondee is stressed, stressed, so that's sort of shouting, I guess. The anapest, this is where we get into a 3-stress line. The anapest is unstressed, unstressed, stressed. Dactyl is stressed, unstressed, unstressed. Amphibrach is unstressed, stressed, unstressed, and then Pyrrhic is unstressed, unstressed. Again, in English, the one that you're going to run into most of the time is the iamb. So that's really the one, if you remember none of the others, And actually, again, like I have to look at this chart to remember what all the rest of them are, but I can identify an iamb a mile away. So iamb is the one that you want to make sure that you really know when you're working with British or American literature. And then we've got different line lengths. So different numbers of feet, different numbers of stressed and unstressed syllables. Again, in English, the most sort of standard one for traditional forms of poetry would be pentameter, which would be 5 feet, 5 sets of unstressed, stressed syllables. But then especially with free verse, when you get really into the 20th and 21st century, people use a wide variety of line lengths. And so if you're trying to scan free verse, which is not always necessarily a particularly useful endeavor, it's more useful to know different line lengths. Also, if you're interested in, say, French poetry, they tend to use the Alexandrine or the hexameter, which is 6 feet. But I've given you guys here also a chart of the designations for different line lengths. So monometer is 1, dimeter is 2, trimeter is 3, tetrameter is 4, pentameter is 5, hexameter is 6, heptameter is 7, and octometer is 8. And going beyond 8 stressed or going beyond 8 metric feet is really quite rare, because that's an extremely long line. And at a certain point, you lose the quality of poetry, and it just becomes more sort of prosy. So again, traditional poetic forms, things like the sonnet, things like blank verse, heroic couplets, the sestina, and things like this, all have their own sort of metrical requirements. Generally, it's iambic pentameter. So the standard line, again, that you're going to encounter in English language poetry, if it's using a regular meter, would be 5 feet in an unstressed, stressed pattern. Again, 20th and 21st century poetry, you get a lot of free verse, which has no regular meter to it. Free verse uses a wide variety of meters, or a wide variety of line lengths, and so it uses that structure to create emphasis for words, ideas, and images, and things like that, rather than using regular metric forms for this. The other thing that I mentioned here at the bottom of this handout is the caesura, which is not necessarily a component of poetry that you run into much anymore. A caesura is a pause within the middle of a line. And you may see it in individual lines, but you tend to not see it in the regular way that you did in classical poetry. So Old English, epic, and lyric, Greek and Latin poetry had sort of regular caesura patterns to them. Contemporary poetry tends not to. Now, again, I've given you on the second page of this sheet, of this handout, a scanned version of John Keats's When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be. Scansion can be a difficult skill to develop. My one office mate claims, and I've never seen her try or not try, she claims that she cannot scan poetry. She does not know how to do it. It is a difficult skill to learn, and it's a skill that I struggled with when I was an undergrad, and I've since developed a pretty decent ability to do it, which is good because I teach a good amount of poetry that has forms. But basically what you're looking for is the breakdown of syllables. So in this sheet I've given you sort of bars between metric feet for lines 1 and 2 of this poem. When I is 1 foot, have fears that I may cease to be, before, sorry, that was one foot, I almost put 2 fingers, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain. So I messed up the finger counting there, but that was, again, 5 syllables, or 5 feet rather. And what we can see here in line 2, this is actually a really important one to notice, the word teeming is not 1 syllable. So when you're looking at scanning poetry, and when you're working with metrics, you're not necessarily counting the number of words, you're counting the number of syllables. And sometimes a word may have multiple syllables in it. So, so in line 12, for instance, we have the word unreflecting. That's it, I'm sort of using my finger to underline it there. Unreflecting has 4 syllables in this context. So this would be of reflecting love. So the 3 words of unreflecting love have 3 metric feet in them. Of unreflecting love, 3 syllables in, or 3 metric feet, 6 syllables in those 3 words. So again, what you're looking for is the rhythm of the line, and you also want to pay attention to accent marks in the poem. Like line 3 here has an accent in what we would normally pronounce as piled, so it's piled. So this would be before high piled books in charactery. So piled would be 1 syllable, piled, boom. Piled is 2, piled. And in this case it is an up-down for that word, because high is unstressed. So high, unstressed, pi, stressed, led, unstressed, books, stressed. So these are the things that you want to pay attention to. But for most lines, if you can figure out the rhythm of the poem, if you can make that syllabic breakdown, scansion is fairly straightforward. When I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace, for instance. So you can get this sort of rhythm, and with iambic pentameter it is that straightforward sort of dum-dum, 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 dum-dum kind of rhythm. And of course, trochees, spondees, anapes, dactyls, amphibrax, and pyrrhics have their own rhythm like that. But again, I'm focused on iambic pentameter because I teach English language literature. So again, if you can figure out that dum-dum, dum-dum, dum-dum poetic rhythm, you can generally figure out the meter of a poem. Good.